Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hybrid Futures Talks, part of the Digital Innovation season here at Central St Martin's University of the Arts, London. I'm delighted to be here with you this evening, and thank you for joining us from wherever you are tonight. My name is Betty Marenko. I am a reader in Design and Techno-Digital Futures at Central St Martin's, where I'm also this program for the BA in Product and Industrial Design. Before we start, a couple quick housekeeping notes. The event tonight is recorded and is going to be accessible on YouTube. Audience, microphones and videos are turned off. You're warmly welcome to post comments and questions in the YouTube chat during the talk for Kay, who is facilitating the event with me to pick up at the end of the talk. Before introducing tonight's speaker, let me share with you a couple of points about the Hybrid Futures talks. The idea that we have is to begin to illuminate the impact of digital technologies on the human and the non-human. So to understand how our ways of being, of working, of living have been profoundly transformed by machines. The devices, the platforms that we are relying increasingly upon, and even the invisible but very tangible infrastructures that we need. Hybrid Futures Talks want to ask questions around issues concerning technologies and want also to function as a forum where we can discuss ways of building creative and critical responses to the challenges technologies present today. And together with a series of skill-based workshops for Central St Martin students offered throughout the digital innovation season, our aim is to bring together creative practices and critical thinking, not just to find solutions to the pressing problems raised by technologies, but rather to ask with technologies we have created about and how we can reimagine human-machine encounters. Now, in the past couple of weeks, I have been thinking a lot about the platforms that we use to work and communicate pretty much 24/7. And with irony of wanting to largely and by necessity through question here would be, how do we retain criticality and agency while being constantly configured and reconfigured by the machines that we must use to effectively perform a function? So what I'm concerned with is simply the fact that we are screens than before. The impact of the platform we rely upon as users. What do they do to our ways of communicating, of existing, of thinking? As we found ourselves with no other choice but to become fundamentally users of and used by a system of networked, interlocked, and stacked digital infrastructures, I sense that this process is turning the flow of our real lived experience into an operational toolkit that recursively then feeds information back to the machines. And this also made me think of what Italian designer Bruno Munari wrote in the late 30s in his manifesto Mechanism. He actually wrote almost 80 years ago that we are increasingly becoming machines' little slaves. And I think a good framework to use to critically position this relationship we're having with machines and platform is expressed by a technocratic logic that deserves a little bit of unpacking. What is technocratic logic? A form of governmental rationality informed by the idea that technical expertise is providing ostensibly neutral and objective knowledge. A technocratic logic is based on a very powerful notion around technology. Instrumentalism, the idea that technology is a means to an end. If it works, it must be good. Solutionism, the idea that technology can, will, and should deliver solution to problems. And finally, techno-determinism, the idea that progress in technology is natural, rational, positive, and inevitable, which also means that a technocratic logic will always equate the technological innovation with a singular idea of the future, chosen by whom, for whom, to whose advantage or detriment, always left unsaid. But moreover, a technocratic logic reduces discussion to the disingenuous argument that technologies are tools. It only depends on how they're used. And here the classic argument is guns don't kill people, people kill people. But technologies are not just tools. They build the social, they actually design it somehow. Things are never just a technical category, they are social one. Of course, there's nothing wrong with having the right tools for the job. And after all, it is through tools that humans have learned to interact and with the planet and with the non-human. I believe that we invented tools to master the world. What really happened is that tools build us equally as we build them. And in fact, humans and tools are, they co-produce each other. No matter how sophisticated the platform, intuitive the interface, or superb the usability, technologies are not neutral. They are situated, generative, persuasive enactors of realities, including realities' unequal power distribution. So far from being neutral enablers or benign reflection of what we do, technologies mediate, orient, and shape our behavior, practice, and mode of existence. But going back to platform, for any behavior, any practice, and cognitive, sensorial, affective capacity that a platform can afford, there will be an equal number of behaviors, practices, and capacities that are denied, sidelined, or devalued simply because they do not fit the interface, the strategy, the choice architecture, the usability narrative, and don't comply with the standardization of behavior expected from us. Now, our direct experience of the world is a finely tuned blend of the cognitive, the sensorial, the affective, the material semiotic, and the non-cognitive. It is this messy, chaotic, nonlinear, experiential apprehension of the world that is turned into an operational toolkit by the technocratic logic of the platform. And think at how every time we log in into a platform, we're not just users, but we're also products. We constantly adapt to them and we adjust to them. Platform design is a way of designing intentions, propensities, and also desire pathways at the precognitive level. And this is where platform design, with its fetishism of intuitive interface and seamless user journey, encounters persuasion techniques and behaviorist units. And this is also where data harvesting, predictive analytics, pervasive surveillance, and algorithmic control happen. The rhetoric of easy-to-learn intuitive tools has also another effect. It implies the expectation of scalability, the notion of expanding a system without having to rethink the basic elements of the system. Now, scalability prioritizes how well all the components will fit. It values precision. It does not work well or accommodate well what cannot be determined in advance, including the mess and the frayed edges of our experience. So what happens to the messing around that nourishes creativity, imagination, and free-range experimentation? Is there a space for a non-standard response to an interaction with the platform infrastructure? We may not have a lot of control over the technologies that we use every day and the values and assumptions baked into them. But we do have a lot of control over how we articulate our critical position, how we ignite a discussion about the values we want to choose, and how we keep on nourishing the potential for creative transformation that is found in frayed edges, that mess of what is non-scalar and non-scalable. I'm going to stop there and introduce our guest for tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce Ollie Palmer. Thanks, Ollie, for being with us tonight. Ollie Palmer is an artist and a designer based in the Netherlands. He holds a PhD, was artist in residence at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris from 2015-2016. His work is being exhibited around the world, including at the Victorian Albert Museum, at the Opera Garnier de Paris, Seoul Museum of Art, and the Royal Institute of British Architecture. Ollie has taught in the Bartlett Interactive of Chicago and TU Delft. Currently pathway leader for the situated design master at St. Joost School of Art and Design, and a researcher in the situated art group in the Center of Applied Research for Art, Design, and the title of all scripted performances, or the absurd in the man and the machine. Welcome, Ollie. When you're ready, please, you can start. Thank you very much for being with us.
Cool. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Betty. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to start by saying thank you for inviting me. It's been really enjoyable watching the talks so far in the Hybrid Future series. I really enjoyed Manu Luke's and David Benke's talk, and I hope I can kind of live up to those standards. So I'm going to talk tonight about scripted performances, digital and absurd machines. The talk I'm going to give has two halves. There is a theoretical background in which I'm going to talk about 3 different types of scripts: computational scripts, performance scripts, and psychological scripts, and also a little bit about the absurd, the philosophical absurd that is. And the second half, I'm going to talk about design work. So I'm going to introduce 3 topics or 3 projects that I've done, which roughly relate to the 3 types of script. So by the end of this talk, hopefully you should know a little bit more about what I mean when I talk about scripts and why these things are relevant, and how I use an absurd framework to critically engage with quite often technological subjects. So let's start with the term script. Script itself is an English word that we know, derived from the Old French escrit, and from the Latin scriptum and scribere. And if you take these 2 words, you have scribere, which is something drawn, a space enclosed by lines, and scriptum, which is to scratch, engrave, and draw. So here we have a space enclosed by lines, and here we have a scratch, and engrave, and drawing. Those 2 things imply space, and they imply time and gesture. So from these, we get the idea of script as in handwriting, and we also have this spatio-temporal act of actually performing the act of scripting. And then from the same term script, in fact, from the word scribe, we get the idea of scripture, which is a set of instructions or rules for sort of living a sanctified life according to whichever religion you subscribe to. And we also have the idea of a performance script. So in this case, Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. That is a written text of a film, play, or broadcast. And from the idea of performance script, we get the idea of the computer script and the psychological script. So that's scripting, like a brief overview of those things. I want to talk a little bit about computer scripts. So the term scripting in computation derives from its directive function. It's a sequence of instructions or commands for a computer to execute. As a 1962 Fortran computer programming manual, I have that one right here, as it explains, program for a computer is like a set of instructions for a clerk who's running a desk calculator. We can tell the calculator clerk what to do with some numbers without saying what the particular numbers are. As this quotation implies, programming and computing involves the production of routine procedural instructions based on a binary logic. The next definition of scripting comes from the late 1990s. I'm going to read the whole thing. Scripting languages are designed for different tasks than our system programming languages, and this leads to fundamental differences in their languages. System programming languages were designed for building data structures and algorithms from scratch, starting from the most primitive computer elements such as words of memory. In contrast, scripting languages are designed for gluing. They assume the existence of a set of powerful components and are intended primarily for connecting components. System programming languages are strongly typed to help manage complexity, while scripting languages are typeless to simplify connections among components and provide rapid application development. Scripting languages and system programming languages are complementary, and most major computing platforms since the 1960s have included both kinds of languages. Now here, Jonke Oosterhout is drawing a distinction between the idea of a scripting language and a programming language, and the important distinction that he makes is scripting languages are designed for gluing. Programming languages are those ones that are used for the fundamentals of what computers are doing, whereas scripting languages are quite often written in sort of higher level language with a higher level of abstraction. So if you've ever used Python or Arduino or any of these kinds of things, you've used scripting languages because they're calling on these lower level functions to get things done. So just as a sort of demonstration of that, these are a load of scripting languages. They all interface with lower level languages to get things done, but they're all relatively easy to sort of get into and start programming with. So within this idea of scripting, I think it's important to note that to write or to script is not to the distinction made by Oosterhout about scripting and programming languages positions scripting as a mediating layer between human language and pure computer programming language. It implies that scripting is therefore removed from the original programming language, but still reliant upon it. To write or to script is not to create the language necessarily, but rather to assemble, to arrange, to copy, and to repeat its element in order to communicate an idea to the reader. And this actually comes back to the idea of scripture. The scribe, for example, is one whose business is writing. And historically, the scribe has been charged with interpreting or transcribing existing words, speech, and language. In Jewish history, scribes were professional interpreters of the law. And in biblical history, documenters and upholders of ceremonial tradition. Associated with education and prestige, the role of the scribe also inferred a lack of decision-making power, as exemplified in the Bible verse, Matthew 7:29. For he taught them having authority and not as the scribes. In computation, scripting manipulates and transcribes a pre-existing programming language to communicate instructions to a computer, and ultimately, by virtue of the copy and paste approach used in scripting languages, to the user. As such, like the cultural use of the term scripting, it emphasizes the act of copying and arranging more than the act of creation. This notion of scripting therefore brings up a multitude of questions regarding the issue of agency and authenticity. It's a set of instructions that the computer must follow sequentially and unquestioningly based on a binary logic. It can draw on pre-existing bodies of work, external sets of instructions, data sources, or even other programming languages. It has dependencies and requires the frame of its parent language to compile. And it can be used at multiple levels of abstraction. So one script can call on another script, which can call on another, and so on and so on. So it's a mode of accessing an incredible amount of complexity with a relatively simple language compared to if you had to memory holding and all that kind of stuff within computing. But then the relation, I think this is interesting because within all of the modes of scripting that I'm talking about, there are different levels of agency that the individual has within the idea of the script. So the relationship between agency, subjectivity, sociality, and scripting has been explored more expansively in the field of psychology. Initial research in this area was triggered by the widespread interest in artificial intelligence in the 1970s, spearheaded by figures such as Marvin Minsky at MIT. In 1974, Minsky proposed a theory about the operation of knowledge structures, introducing the notion of frames as ordering mechanisms for the mind. In this paper, Minsky cites Robert Schank and Robert P. Abelson as both having similar but distinct ideas about this model of thought. Schank and Abelson worked together on this area independently and collaboratively, publishing a book in 1977 entitled Scripts, Plans, Goals, and Understanding, an inquiry into humans, based on what they claimed were questions shared by psychologists and artificial intelligence researchers. Schank and Abelson explained that while psychologists were asking, what's the nature of all knowledge and how is this knowledge used, intelligence researchers were asking similar questions, but with the motive of programming computers to understand and interact with the outside world. Schank and Abelson's book is interested in machine learning applications of script theory and works by breaking down scenes and scripts, predictable and semi-structured orders in which things happen in the real world when people are presented with a scene or stimulus. At around the same time, or shortly thereafter, the psychologist Sylvan Tompkins published his own version of script theory, which was rooted in psychology. Both books adopt a similar underlying premise and, remarkably, a similar title. Tompkins is called Script Theory, and Schank and Abelson also call theirs Script Theory. Tompkins was based on the investigation of psychological affects, the study of emotions and reactions to emotions. His use of script theory was part of a larger set of interrelated theories developed throughout his lifetime, referred to by Ray Carlson as a grand theory of personality. Tompkins' script theory starts with a premise that assumes that the basic unit of analysis for us is the scene and relationships between scenes, as ordered by sets of rules I've defined as scripts. Some scripts are innate, but most are innate and learned. The learned scripts originate in innate scripts, but characteristically transform the simpler innate script. So the first witness innate script is the birth distress cry, which was stimulated at the time of writing in the 1970s by a slap on the behind for a baby and accompanied by a baby's flailing arms and limbs. The second Tompkins writes about is the excitement-driven visual tracking of the utterly novel face of the mother. So his theory is that these scripts are sort of inherent to us at that time, and then we learn more and more scripts as time goes on. Babies then correlate their behavior, the actions and responses they create, with the stimulus they're given in the world. Tompkins calls the stimulus that you get in the world a scene, and we develop sets of rules known as scripts to react to certain situations. A good example of a script that you develop when you're very young, he says, is a baby experiencing hunger and learning the appropriate response given food. Conversely, Schank and Abelson use scripts as a way of, originally they used it for machine learning intent. And the idea is that if you go to a restaurant, if you look at this thing here, John went to the restaurant, he asked the waitress for coq au vin, he paid the check and left. Everybody who's reading this knows basically what happened here. We don't have to know that John was sent to a table. We don't have to know that, the waitress probably gave him the menu that he had to choose, blah, 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 because we know exactly the sequence of events that occurred. And the idea behind this is that we have these scripts built in, and we use lots of scripts as we go through life to just navigate the world, to navigate every time we go to a restaurant, we know sort of what will happen. This is the ordering scene of the restaurant script that Schank and Abelson talk about. And this is their particular language where they have these things called M-trans, P-trans, A-trans, and so on, which is where you're making decisions or you get a bit of independent agency or you transmit some sort of a signal to somebody else. And they break down normal human interactions into these kind of series of coded events. Now, this is interesting from a sort of psychological perspective. If you look at somewhere like Hoogwijk village in the Netherlands, this is a community of people who have dementia. And it's an intentionally designed community where people live within these communal homes. Or sorry, they're not communal homes. People have these communal areas within their environment, have a park, theatre square, etc., etc., and go about living a sort of normal life as far as they're concerned. The theory behind Hoogwijk Village is that people are just very happy. It's quite distressing if you have dementia to suddenly be told 14 times a day that your wife is dead and that you're in a care facility. Whereas if people are able to just go around and go along with the scripts that are presented to them, react to a play that's going on in the square, go to a shop, buy some groceries, it doesn't matter if they forget to pay, this kind of thing, then they can just go along with their lives as normal rather than feeling distressed, 15 times a day. So that is 3 types of scripts: psychological, computational scripts, psychological scripts, and I didn't talk about performance scripts, but I assume that most people are aware with the idea of sort of reading a script. But the idea of scripts comes more into its own when you think about the theatre of the absurd. This is the second framework that I use to frame my own work. The theatre of the absurd was a literary movement that happened from the late 1950s through to about the sort of 80s, 90s, depending on what your cutoff date would probably be for it. But it relies on a type of absurdity which is different to the normal usage of the word. So the type of absurd that I call absurd A, that we normally use in everyday life, is out of harmony with reason or propriety, incongruous, unreasonable, illogical. In modern usage, especially plainly opposed to real reason, and hence ridiculous and silly. So this is a silly absurd. This is something that's just sort of, when somebody says, oh, this absurd thing happened to me, they're referring to this idea of absurd A. The absurd that I'm interested in and that is explored by the theatre of the absurd is this second type of absurd. I call it absurd B, and I find it useful to use the A and B to sort of distinguish between them. But this is something introduced by Albert Camus, and it's a sense of deep disconnect from the irrational, uncaring, and dispassionate world. So the theatre of the absurd, probably the most famous play to emerge from that was Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. And it has sections like this, where these two people are talking to each other. One says, I don't understand. The other one says, use your intelligence, can't you? The stage directions tell the first person to use his intelligence. And he says, now there's a ridiculousness to this scenario because it's very hard, obviously, on stage to portray someone using his intelligence. And it uses this sort of absurd A, the silliness, to hint at a sort of larger scale existential absurd. So with theatre of the absurd, which was a term coined by Martin Esslin in the 1960s, famous playwrights from that period include Albert Camus, Samuel Beckett, Eugene Ionesco, most of whom experienced the horrors of the Second World War, and wrote about kind of these strange scenarios where people had a complete lack of agency, where there seemed to be mysterious other forces acting upon them. But a lot of them use this sort of slapstick and ridiculous, absurd humor to make you realize about the sort of fundamental, incongruous, really unnerving absurdity of the entire world. And the final thing I'm going to talk about in this part is the Oulipo. The Oulipo is a massive source of inspiration for me. It is the Au revoir de littérature potentielle, the workshop of potential literature. And this was founded in the 1950s by Raymond Queneau and others in Paris. And this is a prime example of an Oulipian piece. This is Raymond Queneau's 100,000 Billion Poems. And it's a page of, I think it's 14 lines of prose that each have 10 variants, and you can flip between any and make your own version of this poem. And all of the lines sort of make sense. So you get a book which has 10 sliced bits of paper, and you can just flick between all the different ones. This is a digital version of this poem that I whipped up. But that means that you have 100,000 billion poems potentially from just these 10 sheets of different lines of this poem. In this case, this is, you can see the iteration number here. Okay, and I will go on to why I think that's an important critical tool in a minute. So that's the framework for the work that I do. The first project that I want to talk about is pretty much a pure computational project. It uses the ridiculous absurd to tap into the existential absurd, but it's called 86,400. The reason it's called 86,400 is because there are 86,400 seconds in every day. So one evening I was in my studio and I accidentally Googled the time in Google Images. I must have copied and pasted the wrong thing into something else. And I found it sort of comical that for every single time of the day, you get an array of Google Images that come back. And those images are sometimes completely unrelated to the time that they're given. So sometimes they'll be given, the images will come up because they were taken at that specific time. Sometimes they will have some other metadata that was embedded in the page that Google crawled to find that time. There are a multitude of reasons that each of these images could be chosen for expressing that time or could be related to that time. And so I decided to make a script that's written in Python, which was the language that Google's original crawler was written in. I thought it was quite nice to sort of play with that idea. But yeah, it scrapes Google images for images of every second of the day in the format 000000, etc. Right the way through to 235959. Saves those images into a database and creates a film based on that. So this is a 24-hour long film. You can see here the images for 1914, 1915, each of these being sort of part of a minute of time. And I'm going to jump forward to the film. So my apologies, there's probably a bit of a delay on YouTube because of the number of scripts that it has to run to process this image. But this is a film that plays in real time, that plays one image every single second for an entire day, and just plays continually. But the overall effect of this thing is that you end up just a sea of images that flick onto screen, and you only really process what's happened once the image has changed. So it's sort of infinitely unmemorable. You're constantly barraged by this continuous novelty. And yeah, it's sort of a strange experience to watch this for any period of time. And this, I first showed this at the Palais de Tokyo, and we had it on a massive screen, which is a gallery in Paris. Massive screen, and it was sort of bewildering to see this huge array of images for a whole day. And funny how the different sort of moods came across. So the next piece I want to talk about is called Scriptic. And this is a performance that took place at the Paris Opera. This is more about the idea of computational scripting and performance scripting than it is about behavioral scripting. So this, I could show you a film that gives you a little bit of background about this thing.
This is the system that controls what happens on stage. Each of the dancers has an iPhone in a little pouch attached to their arm, and then we wrap it round with a bandage. Whatever position they go to, you can see as I move this phone here, the three numbers here change. What you see on stage is dancers moving to different positions, and then as they stop and pause, it registers within the system and it searches for a word.
Conversation. Talk.
But both of the dancers have had to learn a really complex series of moves which have been choreographed with Simone. When I first showed him what I had, it was something that was completely impractical and just didn't work for what we wanted it to do. And we sort of refined the software to have different methods of working.
J'ai essayé de donner des positions qui peuvent évoquer quelque chose, qui puisse permettre aussi de créer une espèce de deuxième discours parallèlement aux paroles que le spectateur allait entendre. On a vraiment vu l'évolution du travail avec les danseurs qui ont dû apprendre à dialoguer avec la machine. Donc au début, c'était complètement désemparé. On a l'habitude de danser, mais à s'occuper que de nos pas, de la gestuelle et de l'esthétique. Mais là, il fallait qu'ils s'occupent aussi de cet appareil qui était fixé à leurs bras. Et donc, il avait des exigences aussi, parce que pour pouvoir lire un mouvement, il fallait que le bras ne bouge pas, qu'il soit arrêté. Donc, il fallait vraiment qu'ils arrivent à isoler complètement le bras pour que la machine puisse fonctionner.
So you probably saw a little bit from that film. It's got a heavy emphasis on computation. The inspiration for this, this was a collaborative project with the choreographer who you saw in that film, Simon Valestro, and that film was made by the Institut National de Audiovisuel, just to give everyone their credits. And yeah, so this project was a collaboration with Simon Valestro, the choreographer at the Bartlett de Paris. And the inspiration for the project came when I was reading about an idea called vector space translation. Now, I don't know if you remember in about 2015, 2016, there was a moment when translation technologies suddenly became a lot better online. At that time, I was living in Paris. My French is absolutely terrible. My capacity for languages personally is awful. But I read a couple of articles in the MIT Tech Review about vector space translation as a mode of translating between different languages. And vector space translation is really interesting because it's a machine learning based approach to identifying the similarities or the space that words occupy in a purely mathematical form between different languages. So if we take a word like word, you can say this word is in a sentence. You can calculate the distance from that word to all the other words in a sentence. You can calculate the length of the word, the number of syllables it has. You can calculate the average length of all of the other sentences every time you encounter the word word. And this doesn't work if we just have this word as in a sentence. There's very little mathematical data we can take from this. But the idea of vector space translation is that you crunch billions and billions of words that are in sentences together. So you can take the first, 15 billion words from Wikipedia. You can take loads of open source or open access literature. You can take lots of old news reports, web logs, thousands of emails, this kind of stuff. Everything that's available to, most of this stuff is completely available publicly, but all of these resources that are now used for machine learning can be used to crunch this huge amount of data and calculate. Normally, it's a 300-dimensional vector that represents every word in a language. And the remarkable thing about this is if you crunch roughly the same information from one language, that vector space, the 300-dimensional vector that represents the word word, in this case is a simulated 9-point vector, but those vector spaces are remarkably similar across different languages. And that's one of the reasons that machine translation became so much better in around 2015, 2016. Anyway, I was reading about this and I thought it was really interesting that there are completely non-verbal ways of dealing with language. And I worked with Simon Valestro to come up with a project that would use vector space in order to create a choreography. Normally when you work with choreographers, you talk about emotion and intent and this kind of thing. And working with the dancers, they really needed to know the emotional state they had to embody and then convey. And I wanted to, in a way, fudge what the machines had to do to understand human language, was to really fudge it and make it into this mechanized mathematical version of itself. And I wanted to run the same process with the dancers so that they would have to go through a mechanized process of learning a choreography. So to do this, I used a word-to-vec model. The standard word-to-vec model you would use is 5 billion word or more from Wikipedia, blogs, news, classical text, etc. I took all of the source material from Hollywood film scripts because this was a thing being performed in front of an international audience. And Hollywood films are written specific language that anybody can understand. Normal word-to-vec model has 300 plus dimensions. Scriptic, we use a 3-dimensional version. And standard word-to-vec model has 300,000 to 500,000 words, and Scriptic had about 17,000 words. So I created a 3-dimensional database of words based on the word-to-vec algorithm, crunching thousands of Hollywood film scripts, and ended up with this 3-dimensional version of 17,000 words that dancers had to retrieve using a phone on their arm, as you saw. And in order to make that happen, we had to come up with a specific interface where dancers had to move through 3 axes on their bodies to zoom in onto a specific cube within space, and then pause there for half a beat of their normal timing. And then they could do the same thing again and zoom in on a more dense cube, and then find the closest word to that thing. So it's sort of, it's very much like you use an online map where you zoom in and in and in and in, but in a 3-dimensional form based on the dancer's movements. The second thing to note about this is that the dancers were positioned on the balconies in a way that they could not see each other. In the Paris Opera, there are balconies everywhere. And the whole place was designed in the 19th century as a place to be seen. So you can go and sort of have your champagne on any balcony and be seen by everybody else, be seen going up the massive staircase and so on. But we chose the 2 balconies where you cannot see each other from those places, which are also great for being seen by everybody else. And the 2 dancers go through this process of not being able to, not being able to see each other. And it appears that they're having a conversation where one is talking to the other and the other one is sort of misinterpreting what they're saying and misunderstanding. But really, there's a constraint that I place on the writing of this script where dancer A is reading one script forward. So you can see it goes a fragment, all that remains, blah, 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 and comes down to hello at the end. And dancer B is just reading the inverse of that script 2 lines later. So starts with hello and ends with a fragment. And the sequence of words sort of makes sense in both a conversational form and also in a sort of individual form. And I'll show you extracts of this film now. So in the first part of the film, the dancers are sort of establishing the vocabulary of movement that happens on in this performance. I should also note that the violin sound you can hear is generated by the female dancer's one of the axes that she's rotating her arm in. This is an abridged version of this film. In the second part, the whole thing's in 3 parts, hence being called Scriptic. It's like a triptych, but it's scripted entirely. In the second part, the dancers have phones strapped to their arms, hidden sort of in a band, and they start learning how to perform words. And in the third part, they perform their fragments, the scripts. It all breaks down into chaos and then folds back to a sort of resolved ending.
Conversation. Talk.
Talk. A fragment. All that remains. A conversation.
Hello. A conversation. All that remains.
Throughout this process as well,
Fragment.
Simone and I were confronted with the idea of just faking what we were doing.
Hello.
And both of us completely agreed that we had to have this level of pressure in the work, that the dancers have to know that what they're doing is really done live in real time. And we created this whole interface that was bespoke made over the course of about 6 months, working together, and then 2 months of intensively practicing that created this sort of ability to have. But it was, you can see it now, coming through to the resolution with the final couple of words that they say. About to end. But yeah, it was of crucial importance to both of us that we did the whole thing live and in real time, and that the dancers sort of had to learn truly what it was to sort of like perform with this thing. And remarkably, we only had, I think on the 2 nights that we performed this, there was like 1 or 2 words that were messed up. It was really hard to get the interface exactly right and to customize it for each dancer. But that pressure was definitely palpable. It was petrifying being in the control booth above Warhead. So I realized I only have a couple of minutes and I have a project to talk about that's probably going to take quite a lot of time. So I think I'm going to try and fly through this one. The last mode of scripting that I want to talk about is a type of design scripting. So this is where I apply a series of critical constraints to my own design process and created a film called Network Intersect. So in 2014, I went to a workshop with the theatre group Punch Drunk, and they revealed to me said that they used to put together their huge immersive kind of performances. They take a site, which is a place and a time, they take a text, and they take another text. And they merge these 3 things together to create something that's new, that is a synthesis. So in the case of the set of The Drowned Man, which is the performance that this workshop took place within, was Hollywood in the early 1960s, the book The Day of the Locust by Nathaniel West, and the unfinished play of Wojciech by Georg Bruckner, which has the theme of somebody drowning within it. And combining all of these things creates something that is truly new, that is sort of like a synthesis of multiple parts of things that people somehow already can latch onto, but is completely different from the original thing. So at the time, I was resident in the Palais de Tokyo. We had a commission from the Seoul Museum of Art to put on a show called Urban Legends. And I read this fascinating article in the New York Times Magazine by Adrian Chen called The Agency. And this was 2000 and, the date on this article was June the 2nd, 2015. So this was 2015, 2016. And there were these strange trolls producing weird articles that were just put out online. And there was this army of trolls who were talking to each other on Twitter and on social media sites, which would pump out really weird articles. And Adrian Chen's article itself, The Agency, is a fascinating sort of insight into how that whole thing works from this strange nondescript office building. This is the office building on Google, and this is a sample below of one of the videos that was produced. So this was a video from, I think it was 2014 or 2015, at the peak of the Ebola scare, the Larry pandemic that the world was panicking about. And this was a video that purported to be in an American airport, showing a body coming off a plane. And it has the latest Beyonce song at the time that's playing on the radio. It's shot out of here. The vehicles that are there are American vehicles. It's probably shot in the basement of this building. And they had done funny things like sticking a sticker of, I think it was Georgia State or Florida State Airport and like this kind of thing onto an American truck. And there were all these really weird troll fake news articles coming out. And it just seemed to be like a whimsical sort of thing, some sort of soft power going on at the time. Of course, now we know that the Internet Research Agency has a significant political role that it's played, that's been seen globally multiple times by now. So that was one text I took. The second one was in a network of lines at Intersect from the Italo Calvino, the Oulipian writer's story book, If on a Winter's Night a Traveller. And the location I chose was modern-day Seoul. So Seoul in 2016, The Agency by Adrian Chen, and in the network of lines at Intersect, which is a story about a businessman who sees the world as a series of prisms and mirrors and optical machinery that can be manipulated in some sort of a way. And I used a process called reflexive scripted design to create a film for this exhibition in Seoul. Reflexive, where you take a series of rules, you create rules that you have to follow at every stage that reflect the things that you're interested in. So for me, the form of the film must reflect its content. So the actual format that the film took had to reflect the content of the film itself. The techniques of the Russian Internet Research Agency must be used where possible. So we did guerrilla filming. We sort of went out onto the streets and shot stuff. We used the techniques that they used of miniatures, Google translating everything sort of back and forth into different languages here and there, and also sticking kind of stickers on in public places and using those, pretending they're another place. The third rule that I used was the film must be set in Seoul, and the fourth rule I had was all filming must take place in Paris, because that was the place I lived and that was the place I was going to. Much like the trolls in the Russian Internet Research Agency, most of whom have never been to the US, but yet have to purport to have an American life and be a yoga mom who, hates on Obama occasionally. I was basing myself in Paris, one of the most filmed cities in the world, and making a film about my imagination of what Seoul must be like. So we went onto the streets, we put tube maps up, underground maps up on Metro Line 1 in Paris. And we put posters up everywhere that said, "Remember you're in Korea." And this is Jacine Ima's picture, who helped on the film. I commissioned two Korean actors to help out. And we went back and forth, and each time we did anything, they were given the same amount of information that people in the Internet Research Agency are given, which is very little and very strange little jobs to do repeatedly, again and again and again and again. At some point, it has a moment where one film, the film on the left plays forwards and the face backwards, and then halfway through they switch. This is a reflection of the idea of using mirrors and optical machinery to change the way that the world is seen. So this was actually making two films at once that synchronize with each other, but they synchronize forwards and backwards at the same time. So you'll watch the whole of film one, it gets to the end, and film two is playing backwards, and then at the very end they switch, and film two plays forwards and film one plays backwards at the same time, and all of the cuts happen at the same time, and all of the scenery is sort of complementary to one another. So here is the kind of a couple of screenshots of how this happened. I had scheduled playing the film, but I think it's probably better. You can see the film in its entirety on my website. In fact, you can see Scripti in its entirety. You just saw an excerpt. It's a 9-minute long film, and you saw 3 minutes of it. And you can see Network Intersect in its entirety. Again, it's about 8 or 9 minutes long on my website, and the link will be at the end. So here I should probably say thank you for watching. Thank you for your attention, and thank you, for giving up your Wednesday evening to be here.
Well, thank you, Ollie, for such a wonderful and rich presentation. I'm completely impressed by how you are being weaving together so many things in such an evocative manner. I'm gonna kick off with the question, and as we wait to see and comments from our audience in the chat. I just wanted to ask something about this. Clearly, there is a fascination with languages, whether these are human languages, the languages of the body, the non-verbal languages of the dancer, the languages of the machines. And you seem to be very interested and focused on how to bring them together, find spaces where different languages. And I also enjoy very much your beginning. The etymological placement of scripting. So I guess it would be nice to hear a little bit more of where this fascination with languages and how they intersect come from. Also considering that in those intersections there are spaces where strange things might happen that cannot be translated.
Thanks for asking. I find communication in general fascinating. When I started my master's at the Bartlett School of Architecture, I got very into the idea, and sort of first order cybernetics is very much about understanding how communication happens. Sort of Shannon's idea of differentiating noise from, differentiating important signals from noise. The whole of cybernetic, or the beginning of cybernetics was in radar detection of planes, and trying to work out how massive or detect incoming planes in sort of a future war. But this sort of led on to second order cybernetics, which is about sort of understanding systems and so on. But my favorite theory within cybernetics was one called conversation theory by Gordon Pask. And this is the idea that in any conversation, it's the role that two people have is trying to commonly define. So if you and I were talking and we were saying, oh, let's go to the cinema later, we have this sort of collective objective of establishing what a cinema is. We want to go to a cinema. We want to know the time that we want to go to the cinema. We want to know what we want to see, etc., etc. But we both have to come away with our own definition of what those things are. If I ask you to think of the image of a dog, the image of a dog that you will see is probably quite different to the image of a dog that I will see. And so Pask's fundamental question was, how, when independent minds have to define things all the time, how can true communication ever be possible when all of those definitions are based on the plurality of existences that those entities have had until that point? And that idea really stuck with me. And I think you can probably see in most of the projects that I've done is that there is, in a way, an existential absurdity within design. And I think that at about the same time as cybernetic theory was being developed in that way, separate from that, the theatre of the absurd was looking at these ideas of how language can break down and become meaningless. And I like to sort of juxtapose those two worlds, which are, I think, traditionally thought of as being quite separate, but probably Wiener's thought was sort of imbibed. Norbert Wiener being the person who wrote the first breakthrough book on cybernetics. But I think a lot of his ideas and the terminology was just imbibed so much in the culture. And this idea of the absurdity, the kind of fundamental lack of meaning that life has, is completely there within this idea of trying to break out, like find these signals among the noise. Oh, I can't hear you, Betty.
Almost the arrogance of the attempt to want to control and order and give a specific label and name and place to every single utterance. It becomes in itself almost a Borgesian novel that always slips into the absurd. And it's this connection that you're making, that you have shared with us between the cybernetic research and the theater of the absurd. Thank you for that. Let me just ask Kay, do we have any question? Hi, Kay, from our audience.
Hi guys, thanks Ollie, great talk. Yeah, well, first of all, we have a lot of praise from the audience, lots of thank yous, lots of very complimentary statements. We do have, yeah, but we do have one question from Ding Rui. I'm not quite sure if that's the first name or last name, but they say, I noticed that your projects often include scientists, dancers, and other people outside of your field, and they're wondering how you lead such complex projects.
Oh, I don't really know how to answer that one. I think it's important to always kind of look outside of your field. I mean, I teach design, I work in sort of art and design, I do all of these things, but I think that all of those, you have to be able to pick and choose between lots of different things. You have to be able to synthesize lots of things from different places into whatever you're doing, because if we're just making art about art, it's not going to be interesting art necessarily. Not wishing to disrespect people who do art about art, but that's just not where my interest lies as an artist. And so I really like having conversations with people where the terminology that we use and the ideas that we have and the goals we have for projects are different. So I like working with scientists because the definition of success criteria are completely different for them to me. You know, if I'm working with scientists, sometimes I'm just ticking a box that's sort of like, have you met your public quota of science communication or something like that? Whereas I've worked with great scientists as well, really good scientists, but I always manage to tick that box at the same time. Whereas for me, sort of there's a narrative form that the project has to have, and there are my own set of criteria that have to be kind of woven into the way that the work works. And I like that contrast. I like kind of pushing up against things. And I think what Betty was just saying about the idea of this cybernetic world and the idea of scripts, I think that ties together these sort of multiple ways that you can see things in the world that you fundamentally have an idea that you want to control other things and to shape the world as you want to see it, but also that you have to react to the environment that you're in. Cross disciplines, because you have to react to the other discipline, you have to work within it and learn the vocabulary and the grammar and the kind of the terminology and the time frames that those things involve. But also you have to sort of work to get your own part across and to try to sort of make it what you want. So all of these things I see as being sort of like an extension of conversation theory, that in this case mediated by some sort of artistic output.
That's super interesting, and thank you for that. It really makes me think also about how challenging is to work across disciplines, how rewarding, of course, it is, but also how challenging. And it makes me think of what philosopher of science Peter Gallison writes when he talks about establishing trading zones where that overlapping of different vocabulary and languages can take place, and it's a trading zone. So something is exchanged, and perhaps with the different gradients of advantages and disadvantages. Because it's a constant negotiation. I just wonder, quick to ask you as a follow-up, what do you think is the most challenging aspect of working in such a highly transdisciplinary teams?
I think, honestly, funding. It's a thing that I think most artists will say to you, but actually finding a platform through which you can, in a non, all of the projects that I showed now were funded by a state gallery, Palais de Tokyo. I did this research as part of a PhD. I'm now continuing this research as part of a research group. It's very hard to do these things outside of an institutional framework, and I have huge respect for anyone who manages to do that. But that's when you're meshing together, with a scientist or with anybody who works in academia or whatever else, you have to mesh to different timeframes, and the expectations of the amount of time that something has will always be shifting, will always be changing. So I think that there are probably the two biggest challenges. I think maybe I'm just lucky. I've had quite a lot of success in reaching out to people, really interesting and open to collaboration, and have just been lovely people to work with and produce kind of fruitful things. But I would encourage anyone who's been working across disciplines, just try and find people who seem to be interested in their own thing, really passionate about it, but also open to sort of experimentation and new ideas.
Thank you, that is great. Any other questions from our audience?
There is, yes. I have another question here. They ask you, Ollie, how do you consider that interplay of signal and noise in your work? They say that they noticed a lot of your work plays with this sort of paradeleic search for noise in procedural generation.
Yeah, I think I think as a metaphor for the way that the artistic process works, searching for the meaningful signal in the noise is probably the best. It's sort of like a divining process of what's going to be interesting and what's not. I think it would be hard to find any artist who doesn't have a similar approach in sort of like trying to find something that has any sort of resonance, that has something, because you've got to do a million sketches that are up with the worst ideas you possibly can, and from those things you find something. And I think, going back to this idea of the absurd, in a way it's a reflection of our own continual quest to find meaning, from the things that we're presented with. When quite isn't there, it's something that we have to infer ourselves. So I think it's not just me who has that. I think it's probably pretty common across creative disciplines.
Thank you. Another question's just popped up here from Jennifer. How do you approach slash find the people you work with who are not from your field? So you mentioned to go and find those people. Is there maybe some advice on how to get there?
Yeah, if you are an artist wanting to work with scientists, a really good technique is to find funding bodies. So like the Wellcome Collection in the UK have all of the reports of people who've worked with scientists. But part of the first part of my PhD was reading through like hundreds of funding reports and working out what the networks were of people who worked together. And if you can just find places where this type of project happens, find people who've been situated in institutions that have cross-disciplinary purposes, find people whose names are there as scientific advisors on artists that you like's work. They're going to be far more approachable to new ideas. But also, you won't have success the whole time. You know, you can't just write to anybody and expect them to sort of get back to you. There's going to be all sorts of whatever goes on in people's lives that causes them to not be interested. Don't see that as rejection, because it's just not the right time for that thing to happen with that person. But yeah, just keep finding, I don't know, find interesting ways, find people who talk in interesting places, find people who have done interesting projects, go through funding bodies and find all the scientists, all the people who are outside of your own discipline who have done things with artists, and who, you know, if you can talk to the artist and see if they had a good experience with that person, that's a good thing as well. Most people I've encountered have been really, really helpful and really nice. And I think a lot of people are itching to get out of the bounds of disciplinarity.
Thank you. Good advice, Ollie.
Very good. Do we have time for perhaps one more question, if there is one, Kay?
Not in the chat room, but maybe you have one on your mind, Betty.
I do. It's more of it's an observation. I absolutely love the project 86-400. The images scraped from Google 1 per second, because it made me realize that it was not me watching image for a while. I think time's up. I really want to thank you, Ollie, for such a wonderful talk and generosity in sharing your ideas. Your project has been really wonderful. Thank you, Kay, for facilitating. Thank you to all the audience out there for being with us, and the technicians that have helped us. Very quick message to our current Central St. Martin students in the audience. Please check the Digital Innovation Season website. We have launched an hackathon. There are prizes. There is information for you. So don't forget to check the website. The next ABRI Futures Talk will be in January. So we will see you there. And have a lovely evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.